Today, Aaron Spempanata, our content editor, as well as myself, have the privilege of interviewing James LeBrecht and Nicole Newnham, who are the directors of the documentary Crip Camp. Crip Camp follows a summer camp for people with disabilities in the 1950s and the events that lead up to the disability rights movement and the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are so happy and honored to have James and Nicole with us.
So I'm going to step in, I think. We're so honored to have you guys here. And I also have a background I used to be a teacher of students with cognitive disabilities. So I've had a long, career-long interest in this topic. And your movie, I think, really personally reached both Allie and I for those reasons. So the first question we have, and we got this question from a lot of people, a variation of this question from a lot of people in our community. And I know Allie also had this response to the film. What was the process of deciding to make the film like? So did you always know about the People's Video archive? Did you always plan on doing something with that footage, or was this sort of more recent process?
Nicole, I feel like you always tell this story really, really well. If you don't mind answering the question.
No, I can take. Yeah, we kind of bat it back and forth a little bit. So it really was came out of Jim and I having a really great relationship. We had worked together as colleagues for about 15 years. I've been an independent documentary director and producer, and Jim ran and founded this really incredible sound design company in Berkeley called Berkeley Sound Artists, and had become kind of one of the most well-known sound mixers and sound designers, and really in the country for documentaries, and very beloved in the Bay Area documentary filmmaking community, which is what I'm a part of. And so I had taken my 3 previous feature documentaries to Jim's company, and he had done the mixing and sound design on them, and we had a really great time collaborating, and we really, I think we kind of have similar values and kind of care about similar things. And so over time, Jim started to talk to me a lot about disability community, disability culture, and disability rights, because I think increasingly, Jim was using his position in our industry and his voice as an advocate to advocate for better representation for people with disabilities in film and in the media, and also for better access for artists with disabilities within our own industry. And there was things like, Jim couldn't get into the Filmmakers Lodge at the Sundance Film Festival, well, why not? Things like that. That for me as a non-disabled social justice filmmaker was very eye-opening, So eventually Jim came to me and said, I really want to talk to you about whether or not there are these ideas I have about things I'd like to see around disability that I'm not seeing. And would you be interested in maybe working on a project around disability? And I said, yeah, and we had lunch, and he threw out some really intriguing ideas that weren't really fully formed stories, but kind of themes or areas of concentration were really interesting. And at the end of the lunch, he said, but you know what I've really always wanted to see? And I said, what? And he said, I've always wanted to see a film about my summer camp. And I was like, huh, and I said, why? And he started telling me about this, hippie summer camp down the road from Woodstock in 1971. And he hears he can smoke dope with the counselors, and that's what the whole picture he was painting in my mind was so fun and kind of intriguing, and such a departure from the way that we normally see people with disabilities portrayed in the media, that I was pretty smitten. And then anyway, the thing that was really intriguing to me was that Jim said, I think there's maybe a connection between this camp and the fact that a bunch of people from the camp moved out to Berkeley and got involved in the independent living movement and the disability rights movement that came later. And that was very intriguing to me. So we started talking and brainstorming about the project, and we didn't know that the footage existed at that point, but Jim knew that a Radical Video Coalition had visited the camp, and he thought that, and he said, you should go look for that. and see if it exists, which was really, like sort of the holy grail, like what, because we were thinking, how are we going to bring people into the world of this camp, And we thought about maybe like casting young actors with disabilities and recreating scenes and whatnot. But Jim, you should tell the story of People's Video Theater and what you remembered about them.
Well, I remember that these folks had come to camp in 1971, and that the fact, and I also remembered that they had actually given me the camera for a couple of hours to do a tour of the camp. So so I remember that the word Peoples was in their name, and I also remembered that they had made a short documentary that wound up on Manhattan cable television in the mid-'70s called "The Crab Epidemic at Camp Jened for the Handicap in Hunter, New York," which, while I was in college, my father would call me every once in a while from Manhattan and say, "Oh, your crab documentary's on again," And so that wound up being actually the key to finding the group. Nicole wound up looking online, doing tons of research whenever she could for about 2 months, and eventually found a reprint of an early kind of Video Freaks is one of the names they used to give these folks, magazine, and in the back was an ad for this videotape of the crab outbreak at Camp Jened. And now we had a name for the organization, the People's Video Theater. She went and found some names of the people that were involved, Ben Levine and Howard Gutstadt. And Nicole traced Howard to an anarchist bookstore in San Francisco that he was on the board of directors of, as one will, right? I mean, what are you going to, what's your trajectory in life? Well, I think I'll be on the board of an anarchist bookstore. And so she called the bookstore. They wouldn't give his contact information, but Nicole left her number and why she was trying to get a hold of Howard. We're in the editing room about a month later, and we get this email from Howard saying, yes, hi, yes, the tapes exists, would like to talk to you. And the fact of the matter was that they were actually, after, at that time, 45 years, starting to get the tapes copied over to a digital format. Howard lived in San Francisco, where we live in Oakland, so very, very close by. We wound up going over to San Francisco to meet him at a cafe, and it was a really emotional meeting, because here I was, the 15-year-old kid at the time that he had given the video camera to, and here he was, the guy that did that, and that their mission was to take this new technology and bring it to marginalized communities. And let's use this as a tool. And here Nicole and I were offering to see if we could use all of that material for a film. And anyway, long story short, we had some funds and we helped to pay. They only had money to get some of the tapes transferred. We were able to help pay to get the rest of the tapes transferred so we could see what was there. And thus began an incredible journey. I mean, we weren't sure at the time what we were going to do before we were able to locate these people. How are we going to represent the camp? Were we going to do recreations? And, excited at the idea of maybe hiring a bunch of actors with disabilities, and, that would be really great. But this was an incredible gold mine.
How long did it take overall to produce the film? Because there was obviously a lot of things you had to dig up, and then there was other footage that you probably did. So
it's about 5 years, I think. from
Wow.
start to finish. Yeah, from the time we had that conversation until the time that it premiered at Sundance, I think was maybe just under 5 years. Yeah, which is actually not that unusual for a historical film like that, where you're doing original research. And in this case, you know, there were a couple of academics who were writing about the importance of places like Camp Jened to the disability rights movement, but nobody had really written this particular story. So it took a lot of investigation, a lot of time, a lot of sifting through to kind of, you know, for the clear narrative to emerge. I mean, our original treatment for the film that we wrote to get early grants is not that different than the film itself, but it's always amazing to me how both your original impetus for a project that turns out to be a good project is usually very clear and true, but at the same time, it's like, you know, there's so many things we couldn't have anticipated. And I think the most dramatic one of those was just that, you know, folks from Jened didn't even necessarily remember all the ways in which they had contributed to the movement, because of just the way that we don't remember every single thing we did when we were in our, you know, 20s, when we're in our 60s. And we would literally finding Jenedians all throughout the footage of the movement that came later, and kind of uncovering ways in which this, you know, particular small community of people really had such a big impact. And that was so exciting to find and to, so we kind of learned that we were going to be able to, not just through people's interview and memory, but through actually putting people back in the time through the archival footage of the movement, be able to stay focused on our story of our band of friends, you know, who met in Jened.
I think you both brought up something that dovetails into our next question, which is that for me, one of the most powerful things about this film was that it portrays people with disabilities as people, whole people. And I know from being a teacher that oftentimes adolescents with disabilities are expected to be sort of ideal people, that they are never angry, that they're never sexual, that they're never rebellious, that they never tease each other. And I think that is a, you know, we talk a lot in representation about how we need to provide representations of whole people that are complex. And I think that, Jim, as you pointed out, the project, the People's, what was the name of the organization? I apologize.
People's Video Theater.
So the People's Video Theater clearly understood that implicitly going in, you know, and had a radical approach to representation. But I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about why that element of the story was so important to represent these young activists first as teenagers who, there was a crabs epidemic, they were making out, they were teasing each other, they were deciding what to have for dinner, just living life.
You know, as you work on a film, you kind of see different, you kind of realize things after a while, after you're looking at the footage over and over again. And one of the things that became apparent about the People's Video Theater is that they didn't come to the camp and like go immediately. I mean, they certainly had to get clearance from the camp director, but it wasn't like they said, camp director, show us how you were taking care of these poor handicapped children. They went to us. They gave us agency. They treated us as young adults and teens with respect, which, you know, wasn't happening a lot for us in our lives. And so I mean, I think that's, to me, that was one of the most remarkable things about those people and the footage we had. And in reality, you know, they said, let's make a film about your camp. And we wound up asking them to do a tape that could be our message to our parents. Mm-hmm. And that's where that roundtable discussion that happens near the end of the camp sequence happens. That's why that happened. And
that's actually what I was going to ask about next, because for me, one of the most powerful scenes in the film was when the campers were talking about their frustrations with their parents, and when they all sat and listened to Nancy Rosenblum talk without necessarily understanding what she was saying. And I found that to be this radical, powerful moment of respecting people's difference and respecting people's similarity, you know, our humanity, that I don't think even today spaces like that exist for people who have trouble communicating often. And it was, as you're saying, it was really radical to see the way the filmmakers centered your voices and what you had to say to your parents. Could you say a little bit more about that moment? It's, you know, it might seem like sort of an obvious question why you chose to put it in the film, because it is, I guess, so important, but we'd love to hear about that. And I know other viewers were also interested in that moment.
I mean, when we saw that, we were both absolutely floored. It seemed like we had discovered the heart of our film, you know? And Jim and I, the first thing we did when we got this hard drive of footage was just sit and, you know, together, the two of us, and watch it all. And we knew at that point in time, we knew that it would make people uncomfortable if they didn't understand what Nancy was trying to say, and if we let it play as long as she was speaking. And I remember we said to each other, like, if we can make a film that brings people into the camp and leads up to this moment, and in that moment we've brought the audience along to where they understand that, like, would they start to feel comfortable, but they know that they can push through it, and they notice all the respect and all the listening that's happened because of this community that's developed at this camp, and they stay with it. That'll be like, that's our goal. You know, that's what we're trying to build towards and trying to make happen. And in fact, when Jim and Jim's wife, Sarah, who was our co-producer on the project, showed the footage to some friends early on, people were like, you can't use that. You can't show that. It's going to make people too uncomfortable, you know? And I feel like that's a tension we really tried to explore and use to make a meaningful film. Was that tension of, like, for non-disabled people, or even people with disabilities, but maybe not that disability, to like have them be, you know, feel that they were uncomfortable, notice that about themselves, and then get pulled into all the kind of like the joy and wonderfulness of the community, and for the viewer themselves to want to feel like, we always said to each other, like, we want Jeanette to feel like a party that you want to be at and you want to belong to, and this is a group of friends that, like, you want to have for yourself, and because, you know, that's what I mean. You see that, like, in fact, freedom and joy in every single even still photograph that you see of Jeanette. It's just like, it's completely enticing and wonderful. So that was like, you know, the kind of, I guess, like Corbett O'Toole, who's in the film, said this lovely thing that opening night at Sundance, she said that we had crafted a love letter to the disability community, and we did want it to feel like that, you know. But it was important for us to make people work so that they would push past something in themselves, you know. And always kind of interesting, right? Like, what if we had heard people say, like, oh, you can't put that in the film, and listen to it, you know. I think that, you know, we felt like we had a once in a lifetime opportunity with this film, and we didn't want to do something easy. We wanted to try to get it really right.
I think it really challenges people to have just even that one little moment of insight into what other people's lives are like is very important for able-bodied people, because the world is designed for them. And it's very easy when the world is designed for you to completely forget that it's designed for you. So yeah, that moment is, Jim, I was just saying how powerful I found that moment. I mean, it's just, it really shook me, and I was so impressed that you had left it in, because Allie, did you have anything you wanted to add there? Okay, just jump in if I'm talking too much. So we had just a couple more questions, and then Allie's going to read some questions that we got from our community members who also, like Allie and I, really were deeply moved. We got a lot of responses that were just like, I don't have a question, but this film is so, so, so important to me. So, yeah. So one question I had, especially given everything that's going on in our country right now, is I thought you did a very skillful job of linking the experiences of the disabled campers, the campers with disabilities, pardon me, to the experience of other people involved in other civil rights movements in terms of sexuality and race relations. And so I thought it was really interesting that you didn't shy away from Steve Hoffman's gender and sexual exploration, for instance, or from that of Denise Scherer, or is it Scherer?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. I figured that was a pronunciation, but I wanted to get it right. Denise Sher Jacobson, who was unapologetic about being a sexual person living with a disability. Similarly, you also track the story of Lionel J. Woodyard, an able-bodied man from Georgia who explains that his experience at Jened opened up a parallel for him about his experiences of racism in the South. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the story that you're telling, which is very particular and very carefully told, is also linked to these larger, not larger, I mean national, the intersection of all these different oppressions that we're thinking about.
Well, I think it was important to us that we did the best job we could, really showing the multifaceted support and involvement of all sorts of communities that were really vital to the survival of the folks that did the 26-day sit-in for HEW 504. That that has not really been very well documented or told before. And actually, that was something that, that those people that did that organizing in the Bay Area, they had, folks had been showing up to other people's rallies and been supportive. So when the time came for the support from the unions and the Black Panthers and the Butterfly Brigade, on and on, was not hard to get. Even the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, was like, I'm supportive. And, I just think that was really vital. At the time at Camp Jened, we were looking at all these different liberation movements, and Judy talks to us about, being in the bunk at night and talking about this with other, girls in the girls' bunk, and that, it's not fair that we can't get on buses. It's not fair that we can't participate, and what can we do about it? And certainly, my becoming an activist in my life is directly. It started with meeting Judy Human at Camp Jened, and that she was really showed me that we could actually fight back and win, and that she was just so, you see it in the scene with, what are we the lasagna scene, as we call it, what a organizer she was, but she was and still is to this day this remarkable woman that can really rally you and is so persuasive, and she'll take almost any opportunity to really push back a bit. You ask her a question, she'll ask you a question back. So, and so, I hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. My questions are the overeager questions of someone who loved the film so much, so they're not explicitly clear sometimes. The next thing I wanted to ask was actually about Judy, and I was thinking about that lasagna scene because it struck me. I think that, today there's just recently become a nationwide conversation about intersectionality and how oppressions intersect, right? But the people who were at Jened understood that understood that in the 70s, right? Longer than 30 years ago. And Judy clearly comes off as someone who understood in her bones this sort of radical democracy where everybody has a voice. And I think you see that in that lasagna scene where she's just not gonna decide what's for dinner until everybody gets a say. Do you think that part of the film's work in our culture right now is to sort of educate young activists about how they can do this work through the example of the activists in the film.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we sort of said we had two main overarching goals for the film, right? One of them was to shift the way people perceive people with disabilities in this country. And the other one was to provide a roadmap for movement building and to also kind of lift up and hopefully kind of enshrine this story as one of the great civil rights stories of American history, which it obviously is, but is not taught. It is mostly not known, even by historians, you know. So yes, I think so. And I think that, you know, one of the great beauties of the story is exactly that, is that idea of, you know, in coming together across difference and in listening to each other and kind of understanding, like, I need to ally with someone who's different than me, but suffering from an oppression that's also oppressing me. And the way for me to do that is to like listen to them and understand and believe their experience, as sort of as Corbett talks about, you know, in the 504 sequence of the film. And that's exactly such a critical element of the conversations and movement building and organizing that's going on right now. So it's been very gratifying as the film is making its way out into the world, and it's suddenly bumping up against, you know, the great inequity with which COVID-19 is impacting marginalized populations, and then now the world is engaged in this racial justice conversation. That to see that the movement building and the lessons of that movement and those actions that we feature in the film are still so relevant and alive for people. And I've seen lots of tweets of people saying, you know, if you think movements don't make a difference, watch Crip Camp, or, you know, that kind of thing. Or did you know the Black Panthers were the reason that the disability rights movement, you know, so I think so. I think one point I also wanted to make is that we were very mindful when we made the film that we were choosing very intentionally, kind of to your earlier point about fully rounded human portraits, to make a film that we thought of as kind of a fusion of The Breakfast Club meets The Times of Harvey Milk, which is the, you know, the documentary about Harvey Milk. And that's unusual. And it was because we had this incredible opportunity to look at history from the point of view of a band of teenage friends who we would come to know and love. And that group of friends was, even though the Camp Jened was very diverse, the group of friends and the people in the film that the People's Video Theater shot and focused on were largely white. And we were unable to find a number of the campers of color who we saw in the People's Video Theater footage. So we were very aware that this is basically then therefore history viewed from the point of view of one group.
Yes.
And really it's just one story out of disability rights and disability justice movements, which are so rich and diverse, and there, you know, have not been enough stories told from and by the disability community. So what we tried to do is take the impact campaign of the film and really center the leadership and voices of queer people of color and activists from the disability justice movement, and make programming that kind of brings those lifts those stories up, and also supports art and storytelling from diverse voices in the movement today, so that also this story doesn't feel like it's stuck back in history, but is really connected to what's happening now. Oh no,
I think James is still, yeah, Jim is still here. We just lost his video for a sec. I think you did that expertly. Two things is that one thing you've done so well is show that there's not one monolithic story about people with disabilities that needs to be told. Sometimes when we get a great narrative about an oppressed people, we tend to kind of act like that's the only story we ever need to hear. And I think you did do that so well, of sort of making it clear that this is a very particular story, and it's one of hundreds of thousands of moments in which people have gotten together to fight for this cause. So I just had one last question, and then Allie's going to give you some of the questions from our community. Does that sound okay? Cool. Okay. So Jim, in the course of the film, you talk about going from believing that you had overcome, that's the word you use, your disability to sort of a place of acceptance at the end. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this process, because I know that many of our community members are really interested in that, and that tension is really alive for them.
I think that doesn't matter whether it was back in the 70s or 80s versus right now. There's a pressure on people with disabilities to normalize themselves, that to really be accepted, or to even, one could even say kind of that the goal is to not have your disability matter. That then people will like you, then you'll get the job, then and and indeed things like job discrimination, or gee, are you dateable, or anything else, you know, those pressures are real today as they were back then. But my realization was that I was, you know, almost killing myself trying to keep up, or not even keeping up, but just to hit this goal that really in the long run really isn't attainable. And that what I was doing was kind of denying the reality of the situation. So instead of being apologetic for it, you accept it and you say, look, you know, I'm here, and, you know, there are things about me that are different than others. I can't walk, but that doesn't mean that I can't be the greatest mixer there is if I choose to apply myself with the same kind of dedication and learning that anybody can do. And that really, you know, I gotta say, it's something that we didn't wind up putting in the film, but we had talked about. I remember being in college even, and I wouldn't let people push my wheelchair up hills. I was like, no, I can do it myself. And I was getting like blisters on my hands. I was exhausted. And I literally had one of those moments where I'm getting ready to go out one evening, looking in the mirror, and I kind of go, what are you doing? And I literally felt this weight lift off my shoulders when I came to realize I just want to accept this and that it's okay. And it was liberating, and it was the right thing to do. And look, you know, when you accept yourself for who you are, and you and I don't really even like that kind of way of saying it. It's just when you get to a point that you're okay with yourself, you're okay with your body, with your mind, with anything else that you have, that is something that's incredibly attractive. And that is something that's very meaningful that people will see. And if they see that, you know, yeah, I can't walk, but I go into this job interview, and it's like, you talk about it. You may not talk about it at the beginning. You talk about what the job is about and say, hey, by the way, you know, I've dealt with this my whole life. I know how to deal with this. People with disabilities are natural troubleshooters. You know, we can MacGyver almost anything. That really, that is a huge step forward to achieving that goal that you thought you had, that the only way to achieve was to try to become non-disabled.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think that's so very well spoken.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's very moving, very well spoken. And I, on a personal level, I can relate to you very well. And I think it's hard for the non-disabled community to really understand and sometimes accept and know that just because your body's physically different, you know, that doesn't mean that you can't go on and, you know, be a mixer, go on and be a producer, director. And it's something that I've dealt with my entire life, and I've had to prove people wrong. And anyways, it's just very moving to hear.
I think there's a comfort that I had where my reputation as a sound mixer preceded me, that I wasn't going to have this pressure that I had when I was younger and building my career. And I have to say that this kind of thinking about your life, or looking at one's disability or whatever, is not just physical. It's not just being deaf or hard of hearing or blind, but that we're seeing more and more around people who are autistic, and how awesome they are, and how even if you don't communicate the way that a lot of other people do, that people are realizing that those are voices that are so wonderful to hear from, because they're, we were on a call with UC recently with a gentleman who's autistic, who's a student at UC Berkeley, and he was communicating by typing his answers to questions. But the guy was a revelation to me. I have a hard time kind of explaining it, but it's just that we don't all communicate the same way. We don't all gather information the same way. But that within all of us is this person that, like we do with Nancy Rosenblum, if you take a few moments, you get to see the person that's inside.
It's beautiful. Really, really beautiful.
Thank you.
So now we have some questions from the community. Like Aaron had said, there were so many responses, both questions and opinions. We could spend honestly another hour talking about our community and what they had to say and what questions they had. But we have a few. We picked the most important and most relevant questions to you, but also to our community as a whole. So the first one is, what are some next steps for advocates and allies in the disability community to continue to support and amplify these stories in order to create a more inclusive world?
I think that as a community, we have to embrace what's going on right now in society. And at this point in time, we're dealing with both the COVID pandemic, and we're looking at the discussion in our society in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And that what we are learning is that, even within the disabled community, we have to be looking at how we regard Black members of our community. Mm-hmm. And we have to take a real honest look about how we are being supportive and how we are acknowledging what's happening and looking within ourselves. I mean, there's an extension beyond this that we talk about regarding other people with other disabilities that are unlike our own. And we have to look upon, we have to really consider and talk about race within our community. It is really essential right now. One of the other things is that may not be as, I won't qualify what I'm saying. But there is a story within Crip Camp about really looking out for each other and really supporting each other. And there's a whole movement of disability justice. And really that kind of movement started in the Bay Area, from what I can tell. Mm-hmm. And that it centers around mutual aid and supporting each other. And it's a movement really driven by the current generation of activists. And really looking at it through the lens of people who are Black or Indigenous or of color or LGBTQI. versus what might be considered or has been called the kind of traditional old school organizations that are predominantly white led. And, the group here in the Bay Area, the Disability Justice Culture Club, has been providing mutual aid to other members when we've had crisis here in the Bay Area, starting at last year when the utility company was shutting off power because their transmission lines were starting fires in the mountains, and providing people with money to go to a hotel or money to buy or bringing them a generator. And right now they're doing a lot of work around providing food and other support for people for which they can't leave their home out of fear of catching this virus. We're all vulnerable to this virus. Everybody's equally vulnerable, but many members of our community, if we get it, it is more lethal.
Exactly.
And so this kind of organizing, and Stacy Milburn was one of the founders of this movement, and she, along with Andrea Levant, were managing our impact campaign. And we lost Stacy a few weeks ago, and when we had this kind of memorial for her and this movement, we had a hashtag about Stacy taught us. And one of the things taught us was that we have to help ourselves. That, if you wait for somebody else to help you, you're gonna grow old if you were able to grow old, and that you really need to be active. And it doesn't mean that you have to lift a box. It means you can make one tweet. It means you can, call somebody, or you can just be there for somebody. But you have to do something to help yourself in any way that you can, and you have to help others. And Nicole, what are you going to say?
Add a few practical notes to that, which is that for people who want to learn more about disability justice and learn more, actually, we have a kind of virtual Crip camp running this summer. It's every Sunday, 16 Sundays, and it's free to join, and you can go to cripcamp.com to find out about it. And it's basically a series of conversations and presentations by cutting edge leaders in the disability justice movement. And it takes on amazing array of topics, everything from sort of civic engagement and how to fund your own advocacy efforts to sexuality and the history of Black activism. And it's really fun. There's singing, there's community, there's Facebook groups coming out of it. And so, I think it's a really great example of what Jim said earlier about people with disabilities' ability to MacGyver anything. When COVID hit, I thought, how are we going to have an impact campaign now? Yeah. And Stacy and Andrea were like, no problem. We'll just do this massive movement building, capacity building program in the middle of the pandemic online. So that's a great way to kind of get involved in some of the ideas and work that Jim was just describing.
Yeah, we'll definitely add that, if you don't mind, to our website. I think actually our community would benefit and greatly enjoy it. So I'll look on the website and get the specific information, but thanks for telling us about that. That's great.
Yeah, Nicole.
I'm for about a month, but if you sign up, you can ask for the recordings of the previous sessions. You can email us and get sent the recordings for the previous session. So there's a way to get the entire experience.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful.
Yeah, there's a info@cripcamp.com. That's kind of the portal to reach us.
Yeah, that's how I got this interview set up, was I think this week.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, no, but I'll follow up and get the information for sure.
Nicole touched on something briefly, but literally somebody said, gee, I want to start a Facebook group that's after, like a continuing discussion out of these virtual Crip camps. And I think it's called Crip Camp 2020 is the Facebook group. I go there every day and I am like so happy, so thrilled that of this community that's building, that's being supportive of each other. People, sending in photographs and what matters to them, and they're showing their pride. And, you know, that kind of sharing and finding community is what I had at Camp Jeanette when I met those people. And it made all the world of difference to me that I was, you know, met Judy Human and could talk to her and get to meet other people, for which, you know, as a 15-year-old, you know, even somebody who's like 18 or 20 is like an adult. And, you know, they really showed me so much that I wasn't getting back home. You know, I was a 15-year-old kid who was going to public school, and I was the only kid with a disability in my school. So that group is just joyous. My God, I was, you know, when I couldn't sleep last night, I went on the group, and I'm just like, wow. And anyway,
That's wonderful.
yeah.
So our last question, because I know we're almost out of time, is what was the most challenging part of making the documentary, and what was the most impactful part of making the documentary?
What wasn't difficult?
I think that the most challenging thing, or one of the things that really stands out to me, is the way in which this incredible history has been really neglected and sidelined. And that played out in a lot of our attempts to kind of find the archive footage that would let us tell the story. We would go to archives and we would say, okay, you know, you've got all this other stuff. What about this big thing that happened on this date? And they'd be like, oh, we don't know why. We just don't happen to have that, you know? Or we'd say, okay, we see in your archive, you've got this big box and it has all these papers and all these tapes and some film, you know, can we look at it? Oh, well, actually, we've never opened up that box and we haven't really itemized it yet, and we haven't transferred it yet. And if you want it to be transferred, that's going to take a year. And, you know, we had to put a huge amount of pressure on people. We had to wait years sometimes to get things back and actually see them. And we had to spend a ton of money. And I don't think there are very many folks within the disability community who have had the resources and capacity and possibly like dogged determination, you know, to do that very thing. And so, so for me, it was, it became, I think for all of us, it became kind of like a dual mission, you know, one, to tell the story, but two, to just basically like try to get this stuff transferred, get it cataloged, get it to a place where like people will go, like, you know, people can find it now because it's been in our film. But I think, you know, it is really frustrating the way that even still to this day, and I mean, Crip Camp is just like the tip of the iceberg, right? Like Jim says, you know, the disability community needs its will and grace. Like we hope we're kind of starting to break the ice so that disability will have better representation, and that the stories will be more honored and more told. But it was frustrating and challenging to kind of encounter that at kind of every step along the way of the project, along with the access issues. That were very eye-opening to me, you know, that I would say, well, Jim, we should go to this retreat, and, you know, the resort's not wheelchair accessible. So that was another challenge.
But I think the outgrowth was that my experience in the community had been as a mixer, but when I was a co-director on a documentary, and we had you know, been part of the Sundance family and been funded by a bunch of other places, that I was getting, I had opportunities to engage more, and pointed out to organizations like Sundance, here are the ways that you folks are not making it possible for me to engage fully. And as a result of like really over a day, find a way to get the Filmmakers Lodge to be accessible. It took a email from Nicole and I to the Carrie Putnam, who's the head of the the Institute, look, this is going on. And she said, I had no idea. And within a year and a half or so, there was an elevator. I mean, there was a lot they had to go through, finding the money and dealing with the fact that it was an historical building. But now there's an elevator up to the Filmmakers Lodge in Park City, Utah, where the festival happens every year. And that all of the labs that when we were meeting for Sundance are now accessible, because that resort was built just before a lot of the regulations about access were built. And so by virtue of just us engaging with the world and having somebody with a mobility issue like mine, they can't ignore it. They can't go like there isn't anybody. And it's not like it's just for me. It's like there's a whole battalion of filmmakers with disabilities out there that need not only just the architectural access, but the attitudinal access. That we are capable people. There are stories here that are as important as any other story to be told, and that we can't continue this looking at disability from a non-disabled lens. But the fact of the matter is that our film is through a lens of disability, and that made it a better film, and that people are seeing the value. I mean, Nicole kind of talked about it as being kind of an icebreaker going through and really creating change. But it's happening. It's not just us. It is a sign of the times, but we've had this ability to really advocate communities.
We also learned a lot ourselves. I mean, Sundance has been a great, kind of co-conspirator with us and has really gotten on board. And we found that a lot of the sort of documentary world, once it comes to their attention, they're like, oh my gosh, we have these values of diversity, inclusion, and we weren't seeing this the right way, but and really got on board. But we ourselves at Sundance had this incredibly eye-opening and somewhat painful learning moment where we had just sort of assumed that closed captions were adequate for our screenings at Sundance, and we had members of the deaf community and activists in the audience who had come to Sundance specifically to see our film and were excited about it. When the captioning devices broke, and they weren't devices that were really made to fit in these old funky theaters at Sundance, et cetera, then there they were at Sundance to see our film, and they couldn't experience it. And one of them stood up at a screening and said, why can't we have open captions? And we were sort of like, yeah, actually, why don't we? And Sundance, we all kind of got together that night and said, why can't we? And then we did. Netflix overnighted a version with open captions, and the rest of the screenings were open captioned, and it was fantastic. So I think it's like really about taking that, because there's so far to go in terms of real accessibility, that with Netflix, Sundance, all of our partners, and us ourselves, we've all just really tried to take kind of a learning stance and a listening stance, and to be as responsive as we possibly can.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this was wonderful. Well, thank you both for taking the time. We were honored. You gave us such great insight and knowledge, and I know this is going to be very informative and helpful to our community.